today's webinar is an opportunity to share these learnings around effective shared power with you all and with Kayala as my co-host today. So thanks again for being here. And just to introduce us a bit to what we're going to talk about today, we'll be offering an opportunity to reflect on power, gain a new understanding of power dynamics in cooperative teams, and analyze how power shows up in our work together. And we'll also do some hands-on work to strengthen your team's democratic processes using this power matrix. So for now, I'll pass it back to you, Kayala.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and do a little exercise before we launch into the content of the webinar. So we can share a word or a phrase of, so it's just going to take me a second to make the switch here, but you'll be able to share a word or a phrase, just whatever tends to come up for you around power. So if folks have experience with using the whiteboard, you can go ahead and click on the text box and then add text here on the whiteboard. And if that's at all challenging, feel free to use the chat box.
Yeah, and if you drop stuff into the chat box, Kayala or I will copy it into the whiteboard if that's helpful for you. So. Nice. Yeah, definitely. Power with, power over, those are such important questions, right? How do those things work in a way that's healthy? I know I've often found myself sort of struggling with this question of, well, I have this arena of responsibility. Do I have power over this, or do I need to check back with my colleagues constantly on what I'm doing? All right, here's some comments.
Oh, great. Yeah, I see some of those. I can post those. Ability to influence other.
Mm-hmm. And some intersection of influence and authority. Absolutely. Oh, look, someone's writing there. Control. Perfect. Yes. That's another common association with power and responsibility. Love it. And this one, invisible dynamics complicating relationships. Isn't that the truth? So common to have these things just riding under the radar of what we can look at consciously. So thank you. All this energy to move. I'm gonna post that one in there. Nice.
Force for good or bad. Right.
Yes, energy to move. I love that. And it can be, yeah, absolutely force for good or bad.
All right.
This is wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing there. So we're going to head back over to the webinar.
All right, so definitely power has a lot of different connotations in our world, and I really appreciate you all sort of shining a light on some of those variations on what power means. Some of it's good, some of it's not. And it's really a rich discussion that points back to the complexity that this term power represents and the need to clarify our definitions as we embark on a journey of exploration around power. And so we're going to offer the definition that we found really helpful and useful in terms of organizational applications. But I invite you to just keep sort of mulling this over and share your thoughts back with us either now during the webinar or on our Facebook page or by email. But essentially, in my research into organizational dysfunction, I formed a hypothesis that at the root of all organizational waste and dysfunction was the misuse and the misdistribution of power. And much of this was not intentional, right? Some of it is for sure, but especially when I'm working with mission-driven organizations, a lot of this was just, it was happening and we didn't have the ability to get at it, so to speak. But the first thing I really needed to do to be able to get at it was to define power. And in other words, what are we talking about when we use this term? And I found that the definition that was the most broad and neutral, power as the force of enactment, offered the most useful framing for integrating lots of other definitions and nuances around power, what power it is and how it works. So really, Paul Tillich's definition back in 1954 of power as the drive of every living thing to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity inspired this definition of power as the force of enactment. And one of the interesting things to note about this is that this definition doesn't inherently define power as evil or harm creating. It does leave room for us to be able to articulate the difference between harmful and generative forms of social power. And that's what I was really going for, is how do we make these distinctions and begin to understand how we can surgically operate on power flows as we work together. So it makes room for us to be able to operate in a daily way to transform toxic power into generative power. So with power, minimally sufficient definition of it, I proceeded to look at, well, what's happening in organizations. And so the power matrix was created within this very broad definition and essentially represents 4 different kinds of operationally or organizationally relevant power. Simply put, these are 4 different kinds of power we experience every day at work. They're not the only ones, but they are key forms of power that impact us in our organizations every day. So let's start at the top with autonomous power, which is really the capacity of any single entity to enact of its own volition. And an example of this might be, say, a homeowner choosing the color of paint for their house, or a commuter choosing to take the train instead of driving. That's autonomous power. It is my ability as an individual to choose what I would like to do. Then there's collective power, which flows from the will of the many. An example of this kind of power might be a fundraising team deciding to run a major donor campaign, or a functioning democracy where people can participate directly in governing themselves. Now, on the horizontal axis, we have implicit power on the left, and that's the power that flows from our assumptions and unconscious habits. There's the power of peer pressure, for example, or the power that someone has to influence outcomes by having more time and resources to participate. So these are all forms of implicit power, and there's more than that for sure. And then on the opposite end, explicit power really comes from socially sanctioned roles. For example, a traditional boss, the power that they have to enforce policies, or the power a highway department has to close our roads. So let me give you an example of also how this plays out together in a real life example. So there was a restaurant owner who'd been in charge for 18 years, and he used what's commonly called old school or hierarchical management style. He ran a really tight ship and tended to use his explicit autonomous power to micromanage in a harshly perfectionistic way. In reaction, the manager and staff often tried to anticipate what would trigger him, right? So they didn't have to bear the brunt of his anger. And in this example, the power that the owner wielded was both explicit, because he's the owner, and it was implicit. It's partially implicit because he often didn't state overtly what he wanted or how he needed things done. Nothing was ever written down. And to complicate matters, he often changed his mind about what he wanted and how he saw things should be, but yet expected the staff to sort of do his bidding perfectly. And the staff, of course, lacking this clarity and lacking the collective explicit power to ask for what they needed, would try to implicitly and collectively anticipate what might set the boss off and tiptoe around in fear of retribution. And guess what? It led to a lot of turnover in personnel. So this high turnover then further reinforced the boss's sense that he could never trust anyone and therefore had to micromanage everyone. So that's sort of how it plays out, day-to-day experiences, moment to moment, organization to organization. And today, I want to take it into our own experience in our co-ops and mission-driven orgs. So while the power matrix is a really interesting theoretical perspective on power, I was particularly interested in its practical applications, and I'm going to highlight two of them here. And then today on the call, we're going to actually practice doing those applications. And our hope is that you can learn something from it and take it back to your team. So the first application of the power matrix is to analyze our experience and identify where the use of power may have gone off the rails, so to speak. And just to give you another example of how this works in action, recently an HR professional in a food co-op was asked to facilitate a performance evaluation meeting between two individuals, a manager and an employee on their team. And those two individuals had a history of power struggles going back years. So this is old stuff. And in the conversation, the explicit collective power evident in that meeting with the two individuals was that of management versus union, and the ways that each side was explicit in their decision-making power and struggle, and that both of them thinking that their power was more explicit than the other, right? That they had more right than the other person. And so when each side presented their tensions and made proposals, they sort of postured themselves also with vocal tones and word choices to express how strongly they wanted those changes to be made. So that was their implicit power that they were using in the tones and posturing. And the facilitator themselves used their explicit autonomous power because they'd been asked in to mediate the conversation, to use an clear decision-making process that both parties had agreed to ahead of time, which included listening and mirroring the proposal, asking good questions. And the facilitator also used their autonomous implicit power through their vocal tones and body language and word choices that encouraged openness, validity of tensions, a willingness to make changes. And as a result, both sides were able to agree to a new explicit solution that moved the issue and that power struggle incrementally forward. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kayala to lead us into an exercise where we get to do our own analysis.
Great, thanks, Cecile. So thanks for all that. So now that we have this general understanding of the power matrix, let's put it into action. So starting with using it as a tool for analysis. So we're going to take a 3 minutes here to invite you individually, so each of you to think about situations where a problem surfaced in a team that you were working with. So once you've identified a situation, then we're going to look at it across these four levels of, by who and how was power being used here. So we'll have 3 minutes to explore that. just about a minute left for journaling or thinking on that topic. All right, so let's bring our attention back together as a group, and we're going to we'd love to invite one or two of you to share your examples. What your insights are, and if you had any trouble identifying an example for any of the types of power or other questions that surfaced for you in the process, you can share questions in the chat box as well.
I'll just mention that one of the challenges students often have is trying to articulate what the implicit power dynamics are in a particular example that they're working on. And so for that, you might try really sort of looking under the hood of whatever the explicit dynamics might be. And sometimes defining the explicit dynamics helps you locate the implicit ones as well. But yeah, if any of you have an example you want to share, please do jump in, and otherwise we will move on to the next application of the power matrix.
Yeah, and I did put the power matrix back up, so that, because I know if it's new for folks, just maybe it's the visual supports that too.
Yeah, thank you.
I could make a quick comment about an example if you still wanted.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so I think in explicit autonomous power, there is a very charismatic leader in this situation that I was thinking about. And that tended to result in sort of overriding what could have come from others. And the kind of implicit autonomous power that we saw was that people got frustrated and started to leave. So they used their power in that way.
Yeah.
And the collective autonomous power, I guess, was the board trying to figure out what was happening in this organization.
Absolutely, yeah. Their collective explicit power of the board to try to figure out, well, what do we do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the, what's the other one then? The implicit collective power was the staff, I guess, pushing to have a meeting to go over what was happening.
Nice.
And so on. So.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting, and there's also a share in the chat box here, similar. Having someone who feels like they can say whatever they want at any time, with no restrictions, and people choosing to use their own implicit autonomous power to just disengage from that person. So nice theme there. All right, well, let's move on to the second application of the power matrix.
All right.
So, I'm very practically driven, and theory is great, but I really am interested in how it plays out in real life. And so, the second application is in active use in work conversations. So those situations we just talked about, like how would you have a conversation together that could move that situation forward? And we'll get a chance to do that here together in a minute, but just to give you a little more detail about how that specifically works, because it's a nice idea. We'd all love to be able to do it, but how? Yeah, that gets a little trickier. So the Power Matrix acts as a template for taking challenges we're having together as a team, and through using collaborative communication practices, we can move a challenge and issue attention forward by making something explicit that was implicit before, which clarifies and improves the boundaries between autonomous power and collective power. So let me give you an example of that. Co-CEO of a landscaping business noticed that her colleague was exercising autonomous implicit power by not showing up to the regularly scheduled meetings. And while he and she were technically equals, as lead for administration, she also had the explicit power in the context of facilitating the meeting. She also held a lot of implicit power in that she had more formal education and a knowledge of the communication system that she was introducing to the team. Now, as a co-CEO and a man which was also the most senior person in the company, he was used to being the person with both the most implicit and explicit power in any situation, and did not want to have to participate in a system that would impose some accountability on him. He knew if he used the new accountability systems, it would become clear to everyone, the rest of the staff, that he was avoiding making some necessary operational changes to really free himself up to do the CEO level work. Instead, he let the emergency sort of continue to happen because those would pull him back into the field work where he felt more comfortable. So this male CEO attempted to exercise his implicit power and sat his co-CEO down to castigate her for introducing these new communication tools. And interestingly, in the past, when he had expressed discomfort or threw a tantrum, she had given in and fixed those for him. And this had a lot to do with gender and seniority, as well as their personalities. But in this case, she used her explicit power as lead and the implicit and collective power, implicit and explicit collective power of the group who were on board with these new tools to stay the course and retrain the CEO to this new way of sharing power. So let's dig into how this works a little more specifically. We can use the Power Matrix as a template, as I mentioned. And our goal is to move a challenge forward by making something explicit that was implicit before, which clarifies, improves the boundaries, right, between autonomous power, collective power. The process really is to invite each team member to articulate what's on their mind with respect to a particular challenge, and get each of those down as separate agenda items. We're parsing the problem apart. We're acknowledging we all have different perspectives. We're getting them down. And from there, have your facilitator pick one item at a time and help the team identify what will incrementally move that particular part of the challenge forward by creating clarity around who has autonomous power for what, and where the collective power exists around that particular challenge. Another example to help with this, a team in a training organization I was recently working with had some conflict arise around who was in charge of the description of the courses on the website. The course producer thought they should have that power, and the comms director thought they should have that power, right? No, it's mine, it's mine. Both parties got their hackles up and dug in until we sat down and identified the challenges from each party's perspective and processed them separately to more clarity. In particular, the course producer raised the issue that the web copy had to accurately reflect the course content, right? And the comms director named the need to lay out the course content in a user-friendly language. So we started by processing the course producer's challenge and came up with the agreement that that made by the whole team, that the comms director would use the actual course content in the creation of the web copy, And when we dug into the comms director issue, we added the clarity to their role that they were the final say on the web copy. Although they had to take input from others, that's the collective power, right? Input from others. If it was offered, they had to take that input if it was offered and clearly choose to integrate it or not and explain why and how it would benefit the organization. So with those examples, let's do a little activity together.
All right, let's put this into action for your challenges. So returning to the example of the challenges that you're working on before, let's see if you can all trace the path to generative power for your team in the example. So we'll give another 3 minutes to reflect and journal, and you may find these prompts helpful. Imagine how the individuals in your challenge might have separately described their need in the situation, and write those down. Next, pick one of those and see if you can identify what changes to their autonomous or collective power might help move that challenge forward incrementally. You could describe those changes as new shared agreements between all the members of the team. And if you have time remaining, you can pick a second challenge and see what comes of that one too. I'm going to paste that in the chat as well so that you can see those prompts. Okay, so just taking another minute. All right, so we'll bring our attention back together as a whole group, and then we're going to move into a next activity as small groups in a breakout, using the breakout function within Zoom. Then you'll have a chance to share what you came up with each other, and you'll each have 2 to 3 minutes, and we invite you to introduce yourselves, pick an order for how you're going to move through, and then share your challenge and how you would use the power matrix to move that issue incrementally forward. And as time allows, those of you who are listening can ask good questions or offer anything that stood out to each other. So we'll paste that in the chat, and Cecile already pasted that there. So then that next step will be to move into breakouts. So I will go ahead and initiate that. Let's see. Just gonna... All right. And if you have any questions, you'll be able to ask for help, and then I will be making an announcement into the room when it's time to make the change. So I think we're ready to go, and then we'll open the breakouts. Oh, all right.
Kayla, is there any way to get those last 3 into a breakout?
Looking at that right now. Let's see. Looks like we have someone that doesn't have a microphone on their computer, and we also have I had a note from Rains, who was driving and was going to have to drop out. So we have 2 people in the rooms that we have. So what I'll do is,
Yeah. Well, one other thought is Harriet, Eric, and staff, if you are available to just open your mics and join Kayla and I right now, we'd love to hear from you what you came up with.
Yeah, and staff, if you don't have a mic, you can put it in the chat if you like.
Good point. Okay, Ollie, you got the timing on this? I forgot to set my timer.
Yeah. So I'm sending the message to switch to the second person. All right. So the breakout rooms are, there's 1 minute left, and we'll be back. All right. All right. So welcome back, everyone. And thank you all for that time of engagement there together. We're curious to hear. Since we couldn't all be together for that, I would like to just take a few minutes now to to invite any of you that'd like to share insights or questions that came up. You can share those in the chat box, or you can signal if you'd like to share them to the group aloud.
And thanks, Hazel. It was way too short. We could use lots more time on this topic. So I invite you actually to come next week. We have another event where we'll be diving back into these topics.
Hmm. All right. Well, feel free to continue to share into the chat if anyone feels called, and we'll be. I'll start the share again. The webinar.
And yeah, thanks, Kayla. Also, Hazel, your second comment there, getting into naming the problem is really important. That is absolutely one of the major first steps, is making things explicit that were previously implicit. Because they're implicit, we can't really work on them. We have to be able to do that work of naming. And of course, it's important to have a safe container into which to do that. And that's where the communication practices really help out. But on that front, it's been really great to dive in with you all. There's so much more to cover, and this is a beginning. So as we transition to the end of our time here together on the webinar, I want to just share two offerings that we have coming up that will build your capacity to re-engineer power dynamics in your teams. First of all, you're invited to come to our introductory session on March 26th, 1 p.m. That's a week from today, 1 p.m. Eastern, to further explore the solutions that you've come up with and more as you reflect on power dynamics in your teams in the intervening week. And secondly, we want to let you know about our online training and collaborative communication tools that we've referenced during this call. You'll also have an opportunity to enter the fast track to the certification course, since we have an early bird deadline coming up with a scholarship that you can take advantage of. So on that note, our free call next week, March 26th, we're going to continue the conversation about power dynamics. And today, we really just scratched the surface of looking into how it works to use the power matrix to shift power. And next week, we're going to offer more concrete solutions and tips for shifting power to more healthy ways of using it. And it'll help you to hone in on how to facilitate these types of power shifts in your team. And that's Tuesday, March 26th, same time. And Kayala just dropped the link into the chat box. So if you want to click on that, that's where you can sign up for that call. And the second thing I want to share with you is the next step you can consider for yourself as an opportunity to participate in our level 1 online training that focuses on 5 things in particular that can support healthy power flows. Really an opportunity to take your real life examples, your power dynamics, and learn how to shift those up in community with other leaders from other organizations that are working on their own dynamics. And we get to learn a lot from each other really by being able to share our experiences. Second is building collaborative facilitation skills. Really, in order to shift these power dynamics, we need the clarity of both facilitation and clear processes to make that happen. Also, the ability to strengthen accountability for yourself and your teams, and increasing our collective ability to take collective decision making rapidly, to be able to do that rapidly to the next level. And last but not least, we're always going to hit moments of conflict in a team, and so developing a personal somatic practice is a great way of being able to manage more heat, essentially. So these 5 things can make big changes in terms of how power shows up in your life and your team. And it's really in our daily interactions and skills that we can make a huge difference. So you can certainly take what you've learned today back to your team and make some change. However, for those of you who really want to take this deeper and get more support on making these kinds of changes, we're going to take just another minute to share about our collaborative leadership certification program, so you can consider for yourself if it's a good fit. So our certification program is a 10-week remote learning program from leaders within cooperatives, mission-driven organizations, as well as coaches and consultants and other visionaries who really want to put these tools for participatory and democratic processes into action. So the training has 2 different tracks, one being leadership and management tools for the team. So there's a collective power aspect, and then the other is the autonomous power aspect of our own personal leadership development, which is really critical for us to be able to know where and how to most easily change power flows. So applications for the program are open now, and we're offering early bird incentives and scholarships. So don't let the cost of the program stop you from applying and starting the conversation. We're always happy to work with you wherever you're at. And if you apply by next week, you'll be on our fast track for that generous early bird incentive. And you can find more information on our website, a lot more detail in the program. We go into each session and what we cover there. And now I'll pass it back to Keala to just share a quick bit about his experience in the training.
Thanks, Cecile. Yeah, I've really been getting a lot out of the training already. Even just, honestly, even just reading through what the content of it is like, stirs up a lot of awareness. And the actual practice of having, a learning cohort to meet with on a weekly basis. And some of it is review for me because of different, training that I already have. Yet at another level, there's still a lot that comes out of that new synthesis and, transcendent, including our former selves in the process. And for myself, I have a real deep commitment to understanding the power dynamics, the implicit power dynamics in the culture and socialization as well. And so those are really deep pieces to be able to keep working with. So for me, it's been really powerful so far, and just in the four weeks out of 10 so far. So kind of in a way, just getting into it. Yeah, so that's definitely a bit more for me on that. And so if you're seeking tools for facilitating healthy power flows and ready to take that to the next level, I definitely would encourage folks to take the training as well. And also, if you're just even curious, then coming to the introductory session next week is a really great way to learn more about the solutions and the training itself.
Thanks, Keala. I'll also mention that it's, I think you did also, Keala, just the cohort aspect of things. Being able to learn with leaders from all over the world is really exciting. There's a lot of richness that comes out of hearing from each individual and their background and what they're working with. Everything from mining companies in Africa to consultants in Paris trying to get new teams to be more self-organizing. It's a lot of fun. hope you can join us. All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us and being interested in Healthy Power. I hope to see you next week during our introductory session. And do feel free to reach out with any questions. Both of our emails are up there. You're welcome to reach out to either one of us at any time.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone. Yeah, and thanks, Cecile. So yeah, folks you can open your mics and say bye. If you folks want to do that. All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.